Hello and welcome, my fellow gamers. Ragnarok is coming, and I'm so excited for this next game in the God of War franchise. In this video, I'm going to recap on our current storyline, go over the actual events of Ragnarok as they're told in the original Norse Mythology Lore, and then I'm going to use that to kind of pinpoint where I think our next game's going to go and what I want to see in the next game. Before I get started, this video took a lot of time and effort to create, as I ran into several issues while creating the video that I had to restart, and then I got a new mic finally and had to re-record everything after that again. So if you could please leave a like on this video, comment your thoughts on what you want to see in this next game and stuff like that, that would be greatly appreciated. And most of all, if you could subscribe to my channel, that would be greatly appreciated as well. Now that that's all out of the way, let's begin by talking about the actual story of Ragnarok and relating it to our current storyline in God of War, to try and get a better understanding of what's happening and where we're going. So, Ragnarok, by definition, is the end of all current ways of living in Norse mythology during this time. With that being said, it's the final battle between the Aesir gods and the giants, and only a few gods make it out of this at the end, and just knowing that information can be enough to kind of pinpoint where we're heading here too, with the next God of War coming up. So what we saw in our first game were the events leading up to Ragnarok, and the first two signs of Ragnarok out of three happened at the very end of our first game in this Norse mythology saga that they have going. The first sign of that being the death of Baldur, Freya's son, by the hands of Loki, is what happens in the Norse mythology version of this. Obviously in God of War we have Kratos introduced, and Baldur dies by the hands of him technically, and Loki, because Atreus is Loki. After this, the next signal or, sign leading to the events of Ragnarok, or the prequel of Ragnarok, is Fimbulwinter, which is a long 3-year period of harsh cold winters plagued by wars and all kinds of stuff, which is what we enter right at the end of our last game, right after we spread the ashes of Faye in Jotunheim. The last sign that we haven't seen yet, and it wasn't introduced in our last game, but those characters were talked about in our last game, are Skjold and Hati, the two wolves chasing the sun and the moon in Norse mythology. Odin had released them and they chased the sun and the moon, and the last sign of Ragnarok, or the events leading to Ragnarok, is that they finally catch their prey, leaving the earth in a great darkness. So that could be a great starting point for our next game, honestly, because it could set up the whole scenery and everything in our next game, where we're used to these bright, vibrant colors of the current Midgard, but obviously now a great darkness looms over top of everything, in addition to the winter. So that's the current standing, and it's kind of what happened in our last game with the prequels as far as original Norse mythology goes. But let's continue, because there's a few more key events that I'd like to talk about during Ragnarok that are important to seeing how the next game may go. The key events I want to talk about that happened during Ragnarok aren't necessarily events, but they are the death of certain gods, as there's a lot of trading and death between gods. And these key events lead to certain characters that could be introduced in our next game, or have already been introduced in our current storyline. So the first big event that I want to kind of talk about is, it has to deal with Fenrir. So both Fenrir and Jormungandr are technically out of their timeline, is what we've learned in the first game, as they've already experienced Ragnarok, as a quote from Ymir has said. So there's some evidence of time travel, which is a very interesting thing in our current storyline, obviously. And this is even more interesting because both Fenrir and Jormungandr are meant to die during the events of Ragnarok. But first, let's talk about Fenrir. So we learned that Fenrir has been captured and is imprisoned in Asgard under the watch of Odin. Now this is obviously, Odin taking steps to help save him, because Odin also is meant to die during Ragnarok. And Fenrir is meant to be the reason he dies. Fenrir gets loose and Odin's dead. That's pretty much how that goes. But so with that in mind, our next game may lead us to going to Asgard, and probably will, in all honesty. The only thing that would maybe prevent us from getting to Asgard this early is there's been talk that there may be 3 games in this current Norse mythology world for God of War, as opposed to only 2. So that would be another interesting thing to talk about too later in the video, based on what happens. But we know at some point we will be in Asgard, and that at some point Fenrir will kill Odin. That is the prophecy. After that, Fenrir is killed by Odin's son Vidar. Vidar will be one of the few gods that make it out at the end of Ragnarok. For this next event, I'm going to kind of try to implement more time travel if it's possible. So obviously, this is my opinion, and this could change. Obviously, this isn't what's going to happen, but there's a lot of evidence that Tyr may still be alive. As the whole first game, we've heard about his stories and everything, but they've never said that he's clearly been killed or anything like that, that he just disappeared, no one knows where he's at, and he's presumed dead. But obviously, Tyr is a very intelligent man as far as realm travel and peacekeeping and everything else, and he honestly could be alive still, maybe between realms or maybe like that. He could even be the reason how we get to Asgard, if you think about it. But in the actual events of Ragnarok, Tyr dies to the Hell Watchdog Garm, as there's supposed to be a big battle between those two where they both slay each other. And with the events of Tyr dying as well, there's a lot of speculation out there, and I've seen some other videos where they talk about that last portrait that we see on the wall in Jotunheim of what we presumed was Kratos at first. Like Atreus was holding Kratos, a dead Kratos, I should say. It's presumed that that may actually be Tyr, because there are some key differences between Kratos and that picture you see on the wall. So it's going to be interesting to see, because maybe Tyr's actually alive, and maybe Tyr dies, and that's why Atreus is, holding a dead Tyr and not dead Kratos in that picture as a possible outcome. And it's already known that Atreus has a fondness for Tyr. So with that being said, if in the next game Tyr is introduced, like, Atreus could obviously look up to him more, and Tyr could become a more present character and have an effect on Atreus in a positive manner as that way. And obviously that could explain that final photo in a different perspective other than that being Kratos. As far as the Hell Watchdog Garm, he could be introduced in a multitude of different ways. Obviously, we've already spent time in, the Norse mythology Hell, and that could be just how Garm, comes to play. Maybe Garm hunts us down because we left Hell or anything like that. So, but that's definitely a character that could be introduced at any point during the next game, or if it's split into two, the last game, somewhere along those lines. And both of those characters, Tyr and Garm, will die in the actual lore. So everything's due to change, between our normal storyline here in God of War and the normal Norse mythology. But the storyline heavily revolves around accurate details in the Norse mythology. So I think it's cool to look at that and see where we stand too. The next event is Loki and Heimdall are supposed to end up fighting. Now, Heimdall is a Norse god who's known for having a very great vision of everything, pretty much. He can see all. And obviously, they could link him in a multitude of ways. They could link him in as being, part of the reason why Odin has his ravens thrown around the map in the current game. He also watches the gate to Asgard, so obviously he could literally just be a boss fight thrown at us if we find our way into Asgard somehow. Or, obviously we end up sneaking around him somehow. Maybe they introduce some type of, necklace or something that grants you invisibility to him as a way to sneak into Asgard and stuff like that. But he will be introduced, and it's supposedly that Heimdall kills Loki or Atreus. So if that happens, then that could be a big turning point as we lose a main character in that sense. But I have a feeling that we wouldn't lose Atreus, especially with something that would probably be geared towards the beginning of our adventure in Asgard. But it's still important to look at because that could happen. at any point really, but Heimdall could be introduced that way. After Heimdall gets introduced, this is obviously something that could start our next game, but the next thing I want to talk about is Thor. So Thor and Jormungandr are meant to kill each other, and obviously at this point Jormungandr is an ally of ours.
Time to rest.
But as I said, he's also in our timeline, so he has been through the events of Ragnarok already, which is a little bit different than the normal storyline goes. So that could have an impact on how their fight goes too. Jormungandr could easily end up just killing Thor because he knows how it's supposed to go in the original timeline and ends up living that way. But it'll be interesting to see how that goes in our current storyline. We also have the event where Atreus has that dream at the very end of our current storyline when we end up going back to our house, where Thor shows up at their front door, and that could obviously just been a complete foreshadowing for what's going to happen in this next game. Our next game could literally start with us just being at the Kratos household and Thor shows up at our door. Similar to Baldur, it's just now we fight Thor instead, and Thor becomes the main antagonist of our next game. But in the events of normal Ragnarok, Thor kills Jormungandr, but is poisoned by Jormungandr during those events and ends up dying soon after. Thor obviously has plenty of reasons to be mad at Kratos or go after Kratos. Everything from just Odin being his father to the fact that we killed his son Magni. But Thor also, or I should say, Mimir has been quoted saying that Thor isn't a very caring father, nor would he maybe care about the fact that Magni died. Additionally, Magni and Modi are fighting over who will inherit Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, after Thor passes it down or Thor dies. So obviously Modi is probably in that way happy that things ended the way it did and he's still alive. So he's another, co-founding factor for us as to possible enemies that we'll see in the next game, because he could come back. And it could be, instead of a Magni Modi fight, a Thor and Modi fight. So Thor is a very controversial character in our next game and will most likely be seen, because I doubt Santa Monica Games would just introduce a character like that in a cutscene in our game and not lead to some grand fight with him at some point. Another controversial character is Freya. Now, I want to talk about Freya more in a different video, so I won't cover everything in this video, as I want to keep the video somewhat compact. But it's important to talk about her because she is a character that could lean either towards us as an ally or against us as an antagonist in our next game. And if the game is split into 2 more games after this, maybe she's the main antagonist for this next game, but ends up being an ally at the end or something like that. Now, personally, I'm more on the side of that she'll end up coming around and being an ally. There's a quote by Mimir saying, "Give her time, she'll come around," and that's very, that's a very big quote from Mimir in the sense that he's one of the all-knowing gods kind of deal in our current storyline. Also, the fact that we end up freeing the corrupted Valkyries as one of our post-game quests in the original God of War. Freya's in charge of the Valkyries, and the Valkyries swear to help us when it comes down to it. So I don't see Freya being an enemy forever, as obviously right now she is, but I doubt she'll end up staying that way. But Freya also could obviously become an antagonist, and she could break the curse that's on her and end up being able to use powers to harm Kratos if it came down to it. So there's a giant question mark on her, but it's important to talk about. As far as the actual Norse mythology and Freya dies fighting Surtur, a giant fire demon that ends up setting all 9 realms on fire. So Surtur is one of the final phases of Ragnarok, and that's he just burns everything pretty much, and that's how it ends. And that's how Freya dies too. So obviously that event happens towards the end of the Ragnarok storyline in the actual mythology, and so you could assume that something like that would happen towards the end of that. So whether it's in a 3rd game or at the very end of the 2nd game, that's how Freya dies, whether or not she's our antagonist or our ally at that point. Going off of Freya, though, another contributing factor is In Ragnarok, the dead are resurrected to fight one more battle, and that includes Balder, and that could include Magni, obviously, since Magni is dead. So both of those gods could return, and we could obviously see more battles with them between Kratos and Atreus and those characters. It's just worth mentioning that more so. The likelihood of it, I could see Balder coming back, if anything, maybe not Magni. But the final battle is meant to have all of them there, so it would be really cool to see that. Speaking of Magni and Modi, though, at the very end of Ragnarok in the actual Norse mythology lore, Magni and Modi both live past the events of Ragnarok, including Odin's sons Vidar, Vali, and Honir. Those 5 gods are meant to live on, and they create their own new type of kingdom in a way. Additionally, only 2 humans will survive, Lif and Liftersil, which will repopulate the human population as afterwards, after the new Earth rises from the magma that is created by Suture. So now that we've gone through the formal events of Ragnarok, and we've kind of compared and contrasted that with our current storyline, and looked at the new characters that might be introduced, what should we expect in our next game? For starters, Odin, Thor, Heimdall, most likely Vidar will have to be introduced at some point. And also including on that, Odin, Thor, Tyr, Freya, Heimdall, and Loki are most likely going to die, as these are the actual foretold events in Ragnarok. With that in mind, though, they could take any, change that they want as far as the directors go for this game, and that could lead to multiple different outcomes. But if we're holding true to the actual storyline, all those characters will die, and that also includes Garm and other gods that I've talked about earlier. From here, we could also look to potentially see any of the other sons of Odin, so Vidar, Vali, or Honir showing up at any point. But we also can look forward to probably seeing Balder and Magni again at some point in some sort of way, especially once the great battle begins. The main factor in deciding what changes for me, though, personally, is the fact that there's this time travel element. Because if you think about it, Fenrir and Jörmungandr are the children of Loki, or Atreus, who's a boy at this time. And even going off of that, Shoal and Hati, the wolves in the sky who eat the sun and the moon, are the children of Fenrir. So there's a big time gap in those certain situations. So that factor, I think, will come into playing how the events will change from our normal Norse mythology lore to the God of War version of this. Having a giant world serpent and a giant wolf who have gone through the events of Ragnarok already, and actually probably Shoal and Hati as well, can make a very big difference, especially with having Jörmungandr on your side, and could sway the way of battle when you think about it. So yes, in the normal lore, Loki dies, but I can't foresee Atreus dying. And based off the evidence that we have, I also can't see Kratos dying either, because I feel like Tyr may still be alive. Combining all these theories together, though, is how I'm going to make my prediction. And obviously, all of this is due to change at some point, and most likely won't play out this way exactly. But for Kratos and Atreus, I do see them making it out of Ragnarok alive in some form or manner. Obviously, with Kratos in God of War 3, after the destruction of the Greek world, pretty much, Kratos does make it out, even though it doesn't seem likely. And he's transported to this other universe in the Norse realm. The God of War multi-universe thing that they have going is very complex, but the director has talked about it before, and that's kind of how it works. And I don't foresee Kratos dying during this, and I could see a very similar outcome to the God of War 3 game, where they make it out, and I could see Loki making it out as well, alive. And from there, the directors could take it to a different perspective or a different mythology, or even continue in the Norse world with the new gods still in the next game. Really endless possibilities here, but that's what I foresee for our main characters. But for the next game, I also would like to see some more character development on a few different fronts. So I personally could see the following events taking place. First, we'll have to unlock Asgard in some sort of way. Whether or not that is something we do just through our standard way of unlocking realms, or maybe we find Tyr somewhere between the realms, or Tyr seeks us out, and Tyr actually becomes a real interactable character. And using his knowledge of the realms and stuff, he's able to sneak us into Asgard without Heimdall around, which would be a really cool way to get us to Asgard, and then introduce a lot of those characters. Obviously, we'd be able to be introduced to Fenrir. We could see a scenario where Kratos and Atreus actually are the ones who unleash Fenrir, and it could lead to those events actually taking place the way that they do in the actual Norse mythology. And another possibility would be that if we don't run into Tyr before Asgard, when we do get to Asgard, maybe Odin has had Tyr locked up or imprisoned this whole entire time, and we unlock him there, and he helps us out with any other events that happen at Asgard. Outside of Asgard, there's also a lot of storyline that could still be explored. Obviously, we've freed those Valkyries, and that's incentive for Freya to probably become an ally again, but Freya could also develop into more of an antagonist character as time goes on, and the fact that Baldur will be resurrected can change her idea as well. So Freya will be an interesting character to dive deeper into in the next game, especially if it is split up into 3 different games. Maybe the second game is more about just character development on Freya, and then Thor's introduced, and a lot of stuff goes down with Thor, because obviously Thor is going to be in the next game in some form or fashion. They wouldn't just show him off in a cutscene in our first game and then not do anything with him. It also has to be said, obviously it seems like with the time traveling aspect that Kratos and Atreus have more of an upper hand because Jormungandr's on their side, and it seems like they're more stacked in that kind of way, that they have more characters that are from a different time on their side at this point. Doesn't mean that Odin doesn't manipulate that as well. Odin knows the fate of himself. He knows that at the very end, he is meant to die during Ragnarok, and the only hope that he has is the fact that people live afterwards. That's based off the original mythology, and it's also based off the current mythology that they've set up in the game. So Odin has been taking many precautions to try and prevent this, or at least buy himself more time, but the fact of the matter is he's meant to die either way during Ragnarok. So time travel can manipulate the fact that he maybe lives, or it could also be used to change the prophecy so that way Odin lives, and maybe we do see Kratos and Atreus die. But those are my main thoughts right now. I definitely, if the game is split up into only 2 games, obviously Asgard is going to be introduced in the second game, and everything I've talked about today will have to show up in some form or fashion. But if it's split up into 3 games, I definitely would really like to see just more character development on our situation with Freya, the introduction of Thor as an actual antagonist and having battles with him, and then introduction of Tyr would be really cool and would also set up a lot of hype, because you kind of have 2 sides, whether or not it's Kratos in that last painting that you see in the first game, or if it's Tyr. And it would be cool to kind of put that to rest and see which way that they're taking the storyline. So that's all the predictions I have for today, and they're all based off the actual Norse mythology. Let me know what you guys think. Write in the comments what you want to see in the next game. Is there anything I missed? Just let me know. With that being said, thanks for watching. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.